The person everyone blames is not always the person who caused the pain. That thought did not mean much to me when I first heard it. In fact, if someone had said those words to me a year earlier, I probably would have disagreed. At that time, I believed I knew exactly who had damaged my family. I believed I knew who deserved our distance, our anger, and our silence. Her name was Margaret Bennett, the woman my father married 8 years after my mother passed away. The woman I call my stepmother. The woman sitting in an empty chair on the most important night of our family's year. My name is Jennifer Bennett. I am 42 years old, and until recently, I thought I understood my family's story. Every spring, our family gathered to honor my father's wedding anniversary. Even after he passed away 5 years earlier, we continued the tradition. My father had loved family gatherings. He believed people should stay connected no matter how complicated life became. So every year, my brother Michael, my Aunt Susan, several cousins, and I met at the same restaurant overlooking the river outside Columbus, Ohio. We reserved the same private room. We ordered many of the same dishes. We shared old stories and remembered the man who held our family together. This year should have been no different. Yet from the moment I entered the room, something felt wrong. The chair beside mine was empty. Margaret's chair. At first, I assumed she was running late. She was 68 years old now, and sometimes drove more slowly than she used to. But as the minutes passed, the chair remained empty. People began exchanging glances. Nobody said anything directly. They rarely did when Margaret was involved. Instead, there were quiet looks, small shrugs, subtle expressions that communicated the same thought. She probably chose not to come. I wish I could say I defended her. I did not. The truth is that I was not surprised. For years, Margaret had existed on the edges of our family. Present, but never fully accepted. Polite, but never truly embraced. My father loved her deeply. Of that, there was no doubt. Yet after he died, the fragile bridge connecting Margaret to the rest of us seemed to weaken every year. Looking back now, I can admit something uncomfortable. We never gave her a fair chance. We judged her before we knew her. We interpreted every action through assumptions we had carried for years. If she remained quiet, we thought she was hiding something. If she offered advice, we thought she was controlling. If she stayed away, we thought she did not care. No matter what she did, it seemed to confirm the story we had already written about her. As dinner continued, the empty chair became impossible to ignore. My brother finally checked his phone. "Nothing," he said. "She has not answered my text." My aunt frowned. "That is unusual." I noticed several relatives looking toward the chair again. The atmosphere shifted from annoyance to concern. Margaret rarely missed family events, especially this one. Then the restaurant manager entered the room carrying a large envelope. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there a Jennifer Bennett here?" My stomach tightened immediately. "That is me." He handed me the envelope. My name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Margaret's handwriting. The room fell silent as every eye turned toward me. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a short note. My hands began to tremble as I read the first line. "Jennifer, if you are reading this tonight, then I could not bring myself to sit in that chair any longer. There are things your father wanted you to know. The answers are waiting in the old house." The room remained silent long after I finished reading the note. Everyone at the table stared at me, waiting for an explanation I could not provide. I read the message a second time, hoping I had misunderstood it. But the words remained exactly the same. Margaret had not simply missed the dinner. She had planned her absence. More troubling was the final sentence. "The answers are waiting in the old house." My father's old house had been empty for almost 3 years. After his passing, none of us could agree on what to do with it. Selling it always felt wrong. Moving into it felt impossible. So it remained exactly as he had left it, sitting quietly at the end of a tree-lined street outside Columbus. "What does it mean?" my brother Michael asked. I folded the note carefully. "I do not know." My aunt leaned forward. "Did Margaret say where she went?" "No." That answer only deepened the uneasiness spreading through the room. For years, Margaret had tolerated uncomfortable family gatherings, cold conversations, and subtle exclusions without ever creating conflict. Yet tonight she had chosen not to come. Worse, she had left behind a message that seemed connected to my father. Something about that realization unsettled me. Throughout dinner, I could not stop thinking about her. Which was strange because for most of the last decade I had tried not to think about Margaret at all. When my father married her, I was 32 years old. Old enough to understand his loneliness after losing my mother. Old enough to recognize he deserved companionship. Yet none of that made accepting Margaret any easier. She never tried to replace my mother. In fact, she avoided comparisons whenever possible. But her presence alone felt like an intrusion. Every holiday carried new traditions. Every family photo contained a face that had not always been there. Every decision my father made suddenly included someone else. Looking back now, I can admit something difficult. Much of my resentment had little to do with Margaret herself. It came from grief I never fully addressed. But at the time, blaming her felt easier. Over the years, that attitude quietly spread through the family. Not because Margaret did anything terrible, mostly because nobody challenged the assumptions. If my father changed a financial plan, we assumed Margaret influenced him. If he spent less time with certain relatives, we assumed Margaret preferred it that way. We never had evidence. Only suspicions repeated often enough to sound like facts. By the time dinner ended, my curiosity had become impossible to ignore. Instead of driving home, I headed directly toward my father's old house. Michael insisted on coming with me. The drive took about 25 minutes. Rain clouds gathered overhead as we pulled into the familiar driveway. The house looked exactly as I remembered. White siding, dark shutters, a wide front porch where my father used to drink coffee every morning. Yet tonight it felt different, almost as if it had been waiting for us. I unlocked the front door using the spare key I still carried. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Everything remained neatly arranged. My father had always been organized. As we stepped into the living room, Michael looked around uneasily. Where do we even start? I pulled Margaret's note from my pocket. For the first time, I noticed something I had missed earlier. A second line had been written beneath the original message. The handwriting was smaller and lighter, perhaps added later. My pulse quickened as I read it aloud. Look where he kept what mattered most. Michael frowned. His study. It was the obvious answer. My father spent countless hours there. We moved through the house and entered the room at the end of the hallway. Bookshelves covered the walls. Framed family photographs sat on the desk. Everything appeared untouched. Then I noticed something unusual. Resting in the center of the desk was a small wooden box. I was certain it had not been there during my last visit. Attached to the lid was a white envelope. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words that instantly made my stomach tighten. For Jennifer. Read this first. For several seconds I simply stared at the envelope. My father's handwriting looked exactly the way I remembered it. Strong, precise, familiar. The sight of it instantly transported me back to birthdays, holiday cards, and handwritten notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter. Michael stood beside me in complete silence. Neither of us expected to find something like this waiting in the study. Slowly, I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a small photograph. The photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed my father and Margaret sitting together on the front porch of this very house. Both were smiling. The image looked ordinary, yet something about it felt unusual. My father appeared genuinely happy. Not the polite smile people wear for pictures. A real smile. The kind that reached his eyes. I set the photograph aside and unfolded the letter. Jennifer, it began. If you are reading this, then Margaret finally decided it was time. My stomach tightened. There is something I need you to understand before you continue searching for answers. You may not like what I am about to say, but I hope you will keep reading. I glanced at Michael before continuing. For many years I watched people form opinions about Margaret without knowing the full story. Some of those opinions came from grief. Some came from misunderstanding. Some came from assumptions repeated so often that they eventually sounded like truth. The words made me uncomfortable almost immediately. I never asked anyone to love Margaret the way they loved your mother. That would have been unfair. But I hoped they would give her the chance to be known for who she truly was. I stopped reading. The room felt strangely quiet. My father's voice seemed alive inside every sentence. Dad always defended her, Michael said softly. I nodded. He had. We simply never listened. I continued. Before you judge Margaret for the decisions she made, you need to understand that many of those decisions were not hers alone. In fact, some of the choices that caused the most resentment within the family were mine. My eyes widened. That sentence alone contradicted years of assumptions. I read it again to make sure I had not misunderstood. Mine, not Margaret's. His. Michael leaned closer. Keep going. There are documents inside the box that will help explain what happened. Read them carefully. More importantly, remember that people sometimes carry blame because they believe protecting someone else matters more than protecting themselves. I lowered the letter. The sentence lingered in my mind. Protecting someone else. Was that what Margaret had been doing all these years? I finally opened the wooden box. Inside were neatly organized folders, receipts, bank statements, and handwritten notes spanning more than a decade. At first glance, none of it seemed important. Then I noticed labels on the folders: medical expenses, property records, college payments, family assistance. My confusion deepened. Why would my father preserve these records so carefully? I opened the first folder. The documents showed payments made over several years. Large payments, thousands of dollars at a time. Medical bills, specialist visits, prescription expenses. The beneficiary's name immediately caught my attention. Aunt Susan. I frowned. Why would Dad be paying Susan's medical bills? Michael looked just as surprised. She never mentioned this. I opened another folder. More payments. Different names. A cousin. An uncle. Even Michael. My brother grabbed the papers from my hand. What is this? He asked. I pointed toward the figures. Years earlier, when Michael's business nearly failed, someone had apparently provided financial support. The records clearly showed where the money came from. Yet the signature authorizing many of the transfers was not my father's. It was Margaret's. Neither of us spoke. The narrative we had repeated for years suddenly developed its first crack. Then I noticed another envelope resting at the bottom of the box. Across the front, written in my father's handwriting, were 6 words that made my heart begin to race once again. This is the part nobody knows. My hands felt unusually heavy as I picked up the final envelope. The room seemed smaller now. The study that had once been my father's sanctuary had transformed into something else entirely. A place where assumptions were slowly being dismantled. Michael stood beside me, equally silent. Neither of us knew what to expect anymore. Every document we opened seemed to challenge another belief we had carried for years. Carefully, I broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Unlike the previous letter, this one appeared more personal. The handwriting was slightly uneven, as if my father had written it during a difficult period of his life. Jennifer, it began. If you have reached this envelope, then you have already discovered something important. Margaret gave far more to this family than anyone realizes. Unfortunately, what you have seen so far is only part of the story. I felt a knot form in my stomach. There is one decision in particular that caused lasting resentment. It created distance between Margaret and nearly everyone I loved. For years, people believed she encouraged that decision. The truth is exactly the opposite. Michael looked at me. We both knew immediately what my father meant. 10 years earlier, the family farm had been sold. The farm had belonged to our grandparents and carried enormous emotional value for everyone in the family. When the property was sold, many relatives blamed Margaret. Some openly, others privately. The story became family history. Margaret convinced Dad to sell the farm. Margaret cared more about money than tradition. Margaret broke the family apart. I continued reading. The farm sale was entirely my decision. Margaret opposed it from the beginning. My eyes widened. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. It still seemed impossible. I asked her to remain silent because I did not want the family to know the real reason. Looking back, that was unfair to her. Yet she agreed because she believed protecting me mattered more than protecting her reputation. I felt the room spinning slightly. For years we had treated that decision as proof of Margaret's selfishness. Yet according to my father, she had actually fought against it. I turned the page. At the time, I had received medical news that I kept private. The specialists believed treatment would be expensive and uncertain. Insurance covered part of the costs, but not everything. I feared becoming a financial burden. My throat tightened. My father rarely discussed his health. Even during difficult periods, he focused on everyone else. Selling the farm allowed me to prepare for future expenses and ensure the family would remain financially secure regardless of what happened. Margaret begged me to tell everyone the truth. I refused. Michael lowered his head. Neither of us knew about any of this. After the sale, family members became angry. Some stopped speaking to Margaret for months. Others never fully forgave her. She could have defended herself at any time. Instead, she honored the promise she made to me. The words hit harder than I expected. A promise. That was what this had been all along. Not manipulation. Not control. Loyalty. I looked through the additional documents included with the letter, medical records, consultation summaries, financial planning statements. Dates matched perfectly with the timing of the farm sale. The evidence was impossible to dismiss. Then I reached the final section. There is something else you need to understand. The money from the farm was not used the way people assumed. Attached to the last page was a detailed accounting summary. I studied the numbers carefully. Medical expenses represented only part of the funds. The rest had been distributed over several years. Family assistance, education support, emergency loans, medical bills for relatives, mortgage relief. Every category pointed toward the same conclusion. Large portions of the money had quietly returned to members of the very family who blamed Margaret for the sale. My chest tightened. Michael stared at the papers in disbelief. Then I noticed a handwritten note clipped to the bottom of the report. It was not written by my father. It was written by Margaret. The message contained only one sentence. The moment I read it, I felt something inside me begin to change. Your father asked me to protect the family. I never realized protecting the family would require losing it. For a long time, neither Michael nor I spoke. The silence inside the study felt heavier than anything we had experienced that night. I kept staring at Margaret's handwritten sentence. It was only a few words, yet it explained more than years of family conversations ever had. Protecting the family had cost her the family. The realization was painful because it forced me to examine memories I had always viewed through a single lens. Suddenly those memories looked different. I sat down in my father's chair and closed my eyes. Scenes from the past began returning one after another. I remembered holidays where Margaret sat quietly while relatives criticized decisions they believed she had made. I remembered birthday dinners where conversations stopped when she approached the table. I remembered family gatherings where invitations reached everyone immediately except her. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. We believed she deserved the distance. Now I was no longer certain. Michael opened another folder and slowly flipped through the contents. Jennifer, he said quietly, you need to see this. Inside were copies of letters written over many years. Some came from relatives. Others came from financial institutions. A few were addressed directly to Margaret. What caught my attention was the pattern. Again and again, the documents revealed situations where family members received help during difficult periods. Medical emergencies, mortgage payments, tuition assistance, unexpected expenses. In nearly every case, Margaret's name appeared somewhere in the paperwork. Yet nobody had ever known. Or if they had known, they had never spoken about it. One document stopped me completely. It was dated 8 years earlier, the year my daughter Emily started college. I remembered how difficult that period had been. Tuition costs seemed overwhelming. My husband and I had spent months worrying about finances. Eventually, a scholarship and an anonymous family contribution had closed the gap. We had always assumed the money came from a distant relative. But according to the records in front of me, the contribution came from Margaret. My hands began to shake. She had helped pay for my daughter's education. And I never even thanked her because I never knew. Worse, during that same year, I barely spoke to her at family events. I felt a deep wave of shame. Michael looked equally stunned. Do you realize what this means? He asked. I nodded slowly. We were wrong. The words were difficult to say aloud. Not because they were untrue. Because they were true. We had spent years building a version of Margaret that fit our assumptions. Every action had been filtered through that version. Every misunderstanding reinforced it. Every silence strengthened it. The actual woman standing behind those assumptions had become invisible. As midnight approached, I continued sorting through the remaining documents. Near the bottom of the box, I found a small notebook. Unlike the official records, this appeared personal. The cover showed signs of wear. Several pages contained notes written in Margaret's handwriting. They were not complaints. They were not defenses. They were reminders. Grocery lists, appointment schedules, dates of family birthdays, notes about relatives' favorite meals, information about grandchildren's school activities, entire pages devoted to people who rarely included her in their lives. One entry caught my attention. It had been written shortly before my father's death. Jennifer seemed tired today. I hope she is taking care of herself. Emily looked excited about college applications. Michael says business is improving. I am grateful. I stared at the words in disbelief. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only concern. The notebook continued for years. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Margaret paid attention to everyone, even when nobody seemed to notice her. Then, tucked inside the final page, I found a folded sheet of paper. Unlike the other documents, this one carried a recent date, only 3 weeks old. My pulse quickened as I unfolded it. The note contained a single address written in Margaret's handwriting along with a brief message beneath it. If you have reached this point, then you finally know enough to understand why I left. Please do not judge too quickly. There is still one part of the story that your father could never tell you. The address led to a small town nearly 90 miles from Columbus. By the time Michael and I left my father's house, the sky had begun to brighten with the first signs of morning. Neither of us suggested waiting. Too many questions remained unanswered. The drive felt strangely quiet. For years I had believed the story was simple. Margaret entered our lives after my mother's death. Family tensions followed. Relationships became strained. End of story. Now that version was collapsing faster than I could process. Every mile seemed to carry me farther away from the certainty I once had. Around 7 o'clock, we arrived at the address. It was not a house. It was a modest community center attached to a small church. The parking lot contained only a few vehicles. Nothing about the place appeared remarkable, yet Margaret had specifically directed us there. We entered through the front doors and found an older woman arranging chairs in a meeting room. When I mentioned Margaret's name, her expression immediately softened. "You are Jennifer, aren't you?" she asked. I froze. "How do you know that?" The woman smiled gently. "Margaret talks about you often." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Even after everything, she still talked about me. The woman introduced herself as Linda and invited us to sit down. As we spoke, an entirely new picture of Margaret began to emerge. For nearly 12 years, Margaret had volunteered at the center several days each week. She organized food drives, helped elderly residents complete paperwork, coordinated transportation for medical appointments, raised funds for struggling families. None of this was mentioned on social media. None of it appeared in local newspapers. She simply showed up and helped. She never wanted attention, Linda explained. In fact, she usually asked us not to mention her involvement. Michael and I exchanged another stunned glance. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Everywhere we looked, we found evidence of a woman completely different from the one we thought we knew. Then Linda opened a filing cabinet and removed a folder. "Margaret left this for you in case you came." My pulse immediately quickened. Inside was another letter. This one had been written only a month earlier. I unfolded the pages carefully. "Jennifer," it began, "if you have reached this point, then you already know your father protected me far more than I deserved. What you still do not know is why I finally decided to leave." I continued reading. For years, I believed patience would eventually heal old wounds. I believed that if I stayed kind and remained present, the family would one day see me clearly. Your father believed that too. We were both wrong. The words felt painfully honest. I do not blame anyone. Grief changes people. Loss creates stories that feel true even when they are not. I understood that. What became difficult was watching those stories continue long after the facts disappeared. My chest tightened. I remembered dozens of family gatherings where Margaret sat quietly while assumptions about her circulated freely. Rarely had anyone asked her side of the story. Several months ago, I received medical news of my own. I stopped reading for a moment. My eyes immediately found Michael's. Neither of us spoke. I forced myself to continue. "The condition is manageable, and my doctors remain optimistic." However, it forced me to ask a difficult question. If tomorrow never comes, what memories will this family carry about me? My hands trembled slightly. The answer frightened me. Most people would remember someone I never truly was. That realization finally convinced me to step away. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, simply because I no longer had the strength to defend a version of myself that existed only in other people's minds. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone. The moment I read it, I realized the hardest part of this journey was still ahead of us. Now that you know the truth, you must decide whether knowing it changes anything at all. The drive home felt completely different from the drive that morning. The roads were the same. The weather was the same. Yet everything inside me had changed. For years I had carried certainty. Now certainty had been replaced by questions. The most painful part was realizing that none of the evidence pointed toward Margaret being the person we believed she was. Instead, It pointed toward something much harder to accept. We had created a version of her that allowed us to preserve old grievances without examining them too closely. By the time Michael and I returned to Columbus, family members were already calling. Word about the documents had begun spreading. My Aunt Susan wanted answers. Several cousins wanted explanations. Everyone seemed confused. I understood why. The information we discovered did not simply challenge one assumption. It challenged years of family history. 2 days later, we gathered again. This time, not in a restaurant. We met inside my father's old house. The same living room where so many holidays had taken place now held a very different atmosphere. The wooden box sat on the coffee table. Around it were copies of letters, financial records, and Margaret's notebook. No one spoke much at first. One by one, people reviewed the documents themselves. The reactions were almost identical. Surprise, disbelief, silence, then regret. My Aunt Susan was the first to speak. Tears filled her eyes as she held one of the records. "She paid these bills?" she asked quietly. I nodded. Dad and Margaret both did. Susan looked down at the paperwork again. "I spent years believing she wanted the farm sold for herself." Nobody responded. There was nothing left to argue about. The evidence was sitting directly in front of us. Another cousin discovered records showing emergency financial support during a difficult period in his life. A different relative found documents connected to educational expenses. Every new discovery exposed another act of generosity that had remained hidden for years. What struck me most was how often Margaret could have defended herself, but chose not to. She possessed the documents. She possessed the truth. Yet she kept her promise to my father even when it damaged her reputation. By late afternoon, the conversation shifted away from the records and towards something more uncomfortable. Accountability. Why did none of us ask questions? Michael finally said. The room grew quiet. It was an excellent question. Looking back, the answer seemed obvious. We accepted the version of events that fit our emotions. It was easier, simpler, more comfortable. Once enough people repeated the same story, nobody felt compelled to challenge it. I thought about Margaret sitting through years of family gatherings, listening to comments she did not deserve, watching people judge motives she never had, carrying information that could have cleared her name, but refusing to betray my father's trust. The weight of that realization became almost unbearable. Then my aunt reached for Margaret's notebook. She carefully turned several pages before stopping. "Listen to this," she said. She began reading one of the entries aloud. The note described concerns about a relative recovering from surgery. Another entry mentioned helping a cousin find transportation to appointments. Another referenced birthday gifts for grandchildren. Every page contained evidence of someone paying attention to. People who rarely paid attention to her. By the time Susan finished reading, several family members were openly crying. Not because the notebook contained dramatic revelations. Quite the opposite. It revealed ordinary kindness. Consistent kindness. The kind that often goes unnoticed until it disappears. As evening approached, I found myself staring at the empty chair near the fireplace. Suddenly, it reminded me of the empty chair at the anniversary dinner. The one that started all of this. For the first time, I truly understood what that empty chair represented. It was not absence. It was the consequence of years of misunderstanding. Then Michael spoke words that everyone in the room seemed to be thinking. "We need to find her." No one disagreed. The documents had changed what we knew. But knowledge alone was not enough. Somewhere out there was a woman who had spent years carrying blame that belonged elsewhere. And for the first time since this journey began, our family finally understood that the truth deserved to be spoken directly to the person who had sacrificed the most to protect it. For the next several days, finding Margaret became the center of our family's attention. What surprised me most was how quickly everyone's priorities changed. Only a week earlier, many relatives barely spoke about her unless the conversation involved old disagreements. Now those same people searched through contact lists, called friends, and revisited memories that suddenly seemed important. Yet despite our efforts, locating her proved more difficult than expected. The phone number we had for Margaret was disconnected. Her small apartment had been vacated. Neighbors reported that she had moved several weeks earlier. Nobody knew where. Every new dead, and deepened the growing sense of regret spreading through the family. I spent hours rereading the letters and notebook entries she left behind. The more I learned, the more painful my memories became. I remembered occasions when Margaret had tried to start conversations, and I responded with polite distance. I remembered birthdays when she brought thoughtful gifts that received little appreciation. I remembered countless opportunities to ask questions that I never asked. Looking back, I realized something uncomfortable. Margaret never demanded acceptance. She never asked to be loved. She only hoped to be understood. One afternoon, while reviewing the notebook again, I noticed a detail I had overlooked before. Several entries mentioned a lakeside retreat center about 2 hours north of Columbus. The references seemed casual at first. Volunteer meetings, community events, quiet weekends. But the name appeared repeatedly throughout multiple years. Something about that repetition caught my attention. I immediately called Linda at the community center. The moment I mentioned the retreat center, she paused. "That is where Margaret always went when she needed time to think," she said. "If I were trying to find her, that is where I would start." The next morning, Michael and I drove north. The landscape gradually changed from busy suburbs to rolling hills and quiet roads lined with tall trees. Neither of us spoke much during the trip. We were both carrying the same question. What would we even say if we found her? No apology felt large enough. No explanation felt sufficient. By early afternoon, we arrived at the retreat center. The property overlooked a peaceful lake surrounded by woods. The setting felt calm and welcoming. As we walked toward the main building, my heart pounded harder with every step. At the reception desk, I explained who we were. The woman behind the counter smiled gently. "Margaret is here," she said. For a moment I could not breathe. After everything, after years of misunderstanding and days of searching, she was only a few hundred feet away. The receptionist directed us toward a covered porch overlooking the water. As we approached, I immediately recognized her. Margaret sat alone in a rocking chair, reading a book. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the lake behind her. She looked peaceful, older than I remembered, tired in ways I had never noticed before. Yet there was also a sense of calm about her, almost as if she had finally put down a burden she carried for years. She looked up as we approached. Surprise crossed her face, then uncertainty. For several seconds nobody spoke. I had imagined this moment repeatedly during the drive. I thought I would have a perfect speech prepared. Instead, every carefully planned sentence disappeared. Margaret slowly closed her book. "Jennifer," she said softly. Hearing my name in her voice nearly broke me. Not because she sounded angry. She did not. Not because she sounded bitter. She did not. She sounded exactly the way she always had. Kind, gentle, patient. The realization hurt more than any accusation could have. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. For years I believed I understood this woman. Standing there beside the lake, I finally understood how wrong I had been. And for the first time in my life, I was forced to face the possibility that forgiveness was not something we automatically deserved simply because we finally discovered the truth. For several moments, neither Margaret nor I spoke. The lake stretched quietly behind her, reflecting the afternoon sunlight across the water. Everything felt strangely still. Michael stood beside me, equally emotional, equally uncertain. Years of assumptions had brought us to this moment. Yet now that we were finally here, words seemed completely inadequate. I took a slow breath. "We know the truth," I finally said. Margaret looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. There was sadness there, but no anger. "I wondered if you would ever find those documents," she said softly. My voice trembled. "Why did you never tell us?" She smiled gently. "Because your father asked me not to." The answer was simple, honest. Exactly the kind of answer I should have expected from her. But after he was gone, you could have explained everything. Margaret nodded slowly. I could have, but by then it felt too late. People believe what they are ready to believe. Evidence does not always change that. Hearing those words hurt because they were true. We had spent years proving them true. I sat down beside her. For the first time in more than a decade, I felt like I was speaking to the real Margaret rather than the version I had created in my mind. "I am sorry," I whispered. The words sounded small compared to the damage they represented. I should have asked questions. I should have listened. I should have given you a chance. Tears filled my eyes. Instead, I judged you. Margaret reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "Jennifer, grief makes people see the world through pain." I understood that. But that does not excuse what we did. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled sadly. "No, it does not. But carrying regret forever does not help either." Michael stepped forward. His voice cracked as he spoke. You helped me when my business nearly failed. I never knew. I spent years blaming you for things that were not your fault." Margaret looked at him with the same kindness she had always shown everyone. "You were trying to survive. That is all I ever wanted for any of you." We spent the next several hours talking beside the lake. Really talking. Not exchanging polite greetings at family gatherings. Not enduring awkward conversations. Talking honestly. For the first time, Margaret shared stories about her life before meeting my father. She spoke about her fears after marrying into a family that never fully accepted her. She spoke about promises she made to my father and sacrifices she never expected anyone to discover. Most importantly, she spoke without bitterness. That may have been the hardest part to understand. After everything she experienced, she still cared about us. A week later, Margaret agreed to attend a family gathering. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. No one ignored her arrival. No one kept their distance. Relatives who had not spoken kindly to her in years approached with tears in their eyes. Some apologized. Others simply thanked her. My Aunt Susan hugged her for nearly a minute before either woman could speak. The reconciliation was not perfect. Years of misunderstanding cannot disappear overnight. But something important happened that day. The truth finally replaced the story we had repeated for so long. Later that evening, everyone gathered in the living room of my father's old house. The wooden box sat on the table once again. Beside it rested a framed photograph of my father. Margaret stood quietly looking at the picture. "He would be embarrassed by all this attention," she said with a laugh. The room filled with gentle smiles. She was probably right. Before leaving, I noticed the chair near the fireplace. The same chair that had felt so empty only days earlier. This time, Margaret was sitting in it, surrounded by family members listening to her stories. The sight stopped me in my tracks. At that moment, I finally understood what my father had tried to protect all those years. Not a secret, not a financial decision, not a reputation. He was protecting the truth about a woman whose greatest mistake was loving a family that never truly saw her. Fortunately, before it was too late, we finally did. And from that day forward, Margaret Bennett was no longer the woman our family misunderstood. She became the woman our family would never forget.